Today's reading is from one of the most important contemporary ethicists, Peter Singer. Singer has written about a variety of topics, but he's most known for his work on animal ethics, specifically the question of whether animals, other than humans, have moral rights. Singer is an important and controversial ethical theorist who's currently a professor at Princeton University. He's also an animal rights activist, and his text Animal Liberation is an important text for the animal rights movement. He wants to create a unified ethical theory that will apply to both human beings and other animal species. Singer believes that most people are guilty of what he calls speciesism, and while that's a funny-sounding word, think of it in terms of something like racism or sexism. We know that racism, for example, is the belief that one race is better or more important than others. So similarly, speciesism is the belief that one species, specifically our own, is more important than other species. As a result, humans who are speciesists put our own interests before those of other species, even when their interests should outweigh ours. And while it might be difficult for some of us to think of an instance where the rights of a member of another species outweigh our own rights, Singer and other animal rights activists ask us to think about, for example, what's more important, my right to wear a mink coat or a mink's right to life? And regardless of how you personally might answer that question, it should give you a good idea of what Singer means when he talks about speciesism. Singer thinks that some ways of arguing for animal rights are better than others. He wants to argue in particular that non-human animals should be considered equally important with humans in ethical decisions. However, he doesn't think that all possible ways of arguing for this point are equally effective. In particular, he claims that many animal rights activists like to argue that, well, all people are equal, so maybe we can just extend that to other species. Singer, however, thinks that this is not a good way to argue for animal rights, or even to argue against racism or sexism for that matter. So why on earth would he think something like that? It seems that most people believe that we're all equal, so why wouldn't this be a good starting point? Well, Singer concludes that we've misunderstood the true nature of equality, and once we see what that true nature is, we'll understand that there are better ways of arguing for animal rights or arguing against racism and sexism than simply saying that all people are equal. So what specifically does Singer think is the problem with arguing against racists and sexists by saying that all people are equal? Well, he says it isn't a strong argument for a couple of different reasons. First of all, he says it isn't really true in that all people aren't equal in all ways. It's clear that some people are taller than other people, or maybe they have more years of education, or they can run more quickly. So there will always be ways to discriminate. If someone is really determined to discriminate against a group of people, they'll find some point of inequality. Now, we might respond that those points of inequality really aren't very significant, and that there certainly aren't any inequalities that break down along racial or gender lines. However, Singer says that we really can't even be certain that there truly aren't any important racial or gender differences between people. For example, men tend on average to be physically stronger than women, able to lift heavier weights, for example. And while this is a huge oversimplification for a lot of different reasons, it is a difference that most people acknowledge exists. So if we want to argue that all people have equal rights because they're simply all equal, Singer says it would be easy for an opponent of this position to point out that, well, men are stronger than women, so does that mean that men have more rights than women based on this difference? And of course, Singer doesn't think that this should be the case. He does think that all people should have equal rights. His point is that if we want to argue for equal rights, we shouldn't do it based on this statement that all people are equal, because it's easy to prove that that statement isn't really true. So why do so many people use this argument to argue against racism or sexism? Well, Singer thinks that there's a subtle error in reasoning that underlies this statement that all people are equal. He says that equality is a moral ideal, not a simple assertion of fact. And what that means is that when we say all people are equal, that's not really what we mean. We're not claiming that every single person is exactly equal to every other person in every possible way. Instead, we're saying something about how we think the world should be. Specifically, when we make the statement all people are equal, which, if you remember from earlier in the semester, is what we call a descriptive or is statement, we actually mean we should treat all people equally, which is a prescriptive or ought statement. And you may remember that we had a name for this type of error in reasoning that occurs when we make a descriptive statement, but we actually mean something prescriptive. We call this the naturalistic fallacy, confusing is and ought statements. So what does Singer think the true meaning of equality actually is? Well, he says that the true equality among all people is equality of consideration, and this means that we should all be treated equally, regardless of whether there are any differences or inequalities among us. Now, on what basis does Singer conclude that we all deserve equal treatment? And this is a central part of his ethics. He says that we all deserve equal treatment because we all have the ability to suffer. And any being who's capable of suffering deserves to have its suffering minimized as much as possible. But, he says, other species can also suffer, therefore those other species also deserve equal treatment. And this doesn't mean identical treatment, by the way. Singer gives the example of the right to vote, whereas clearly every human being who's capable should have the right to vote regardless of gender or race or anything like that. He says it would be meaningless to talk about giving cows or pigs the right to vote, since they're not capable of understanding what voting even is. So because of this focus on minimizing suffering, we can say that Singer is an example of a utilitarian. So you remember that we studied Mill's utilitarianism earlier in the semester, so here we have an example of a contemporary philosopher who is using some of Mill's principles to argue about a contemporary moral issue. So to summarize Singer's general argument, he first states that any being that can suffer has moral rights. His second premise is that non-human animals can suffer. Therefore, he concludes that non-human animals have moral rights. And while a lot of people would disagree with this reasoning, he goes on to make an even more controversial statement that beings that can't suffer, like severely disabled human infants, don't actually have moral rights. And I'm sure you can imagine how statements like that have made Singer an extremely controversial figure. Over the years, there have been protests against his work by disability rights advocates and others who find his conclusions offensive and repulsive. On a more abstract philosophical level, some of Singer's opponents claim that he's committing the fallacy of weak analogy. And like the naturalistic fallacy or hasty generalization, weak analogy is an error in reasoning. Specifically, weak analogy means drawing a conclusion based on an analogy that is defective. So, for example, if I were to say, my neighbor had her appendix removed, and the next day she won the lottery, so if I want to win the lottery, I should have my appendix removed too. That would be an example of weak analogy, because I'm seeing a connection between having your appendix removed and winning the lottery, which really isn't there. It's almost certainly just a coincidence that those two things happened to my neighbor on 2 consecutive days. So in the case of Singer, his opponents claim that the connection between having the ability to suffer and having moral rights is just as weak as the connection between having your appendix removed and winning the lottery. And for this reason, they say that Singer can't extend his argument to non-human animals just because they also happen to have the ability to suffer. Now, Singer's supporters think that his opponents might be committing fallacies too. For example, the fallacy of slippery slope means drawing a conclusion based on an unlikely chain reaction. Some of Singer's opponents have argued that if we were to ever follow his ethical theory, we'd wind up killing off people left and right just because we felt that they couldn't suffer, and that this would eventually lead to genocide, something equivalent to another Nazi Germany. And while, of course, nobody wants another genocide to occur, even most of Singer's opponents think that this is an overstatement of the consequences that would occur if we were to ever adopt Singer's ethical theory. Another fallacy that Singer's opponents might be guilty of committing is the straw man fallacy, and that means you attack a distorted version of your opponent's argument. So, for example, if someone were to say, Singer thinks that cockroaches are more important than humans, that's ridiculous, they'd be committing the straw man fallacy, because Singer doesn't say that cockroaches are more important than humans. He says that all beings who are capable of suffering deserve equal consideration and equal treatment. So you can see that Singer's ideas are pretty controversial, and that there are heated opinions on both sides of the animal rights and animal ethics question. However, Singer is still one of the most important contemporary ethicists, and he's extremely well respected within the philosophical community. So his work gives us a great example of a philosopher actually using some of the ethical theories that we've studied this semester to address a contemporary moral issue.